All right, well, boy, this has just been a really wonderful day and a half for us at the Planetary Health Alliance, and none of this would have happened without all of you making such an enormous effort to join us from all over the world. So thank you so much for being here. I get to introduce Gina McCarthy, which is one of the great pleasures of this day and a half. So Gina is the former head of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. She grew up here in Boston. She has the great sense to be an avid Red Sox fan. She served 5 Massachusetts Democratic and Republican administrations and was commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. She joined the EPA in 2009 as assistant administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, and in 2013, she was chosen by President Obama to spearhead his climate efforts at the federal level as EPA administrator. During her tenure, EPA initiatives cut air pollution, protected water resources, reduced greenhouse gases, and strengthened chemical safety to better protect more Americans, especially the most vulnerable from negative health impacts. Internationally, Ms. McCarthy worked with the UN and WHO on a variety of efforts and represented the U.S. on global initiatives to reduce high-risk sources of pollution. In short, Ms. McCarthy has spent a career at the highest level achieving successes in planetary health. There could be no one more fitting to bring this meeting to a close than Gina McCarthy.
Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate it, and thanks for inviting me. I had no idea I was doing planetary health until Sam told me. So this is very exciting. And I also really have to recognize Senator Worth, who is one of my champions, my heroes. We have worked together for a very long time, and he is not just one of the smartest people that I know, but he's clever and he's dedicated and he's a wonderful human being. So it's my pleasure to be here with him. Let me begin by telling you that I have a terrible cold and bronchitis, but the good news is I do not have a raging urinary tract infection. So I have to just embrace that as the good news of today. So I'll be popping these little cough drops while I talk, but I really don't want to spend a lot of time wrapping up because I know you've been in this room for like a day and a half and you've heard a lot of stories, and I think my job really is to do just a couple of things. One is to thank you for being here and for your engagement. And 2 is to tell you that yeah, you really have to do what my mother used to say, which is to pull up your big boy pants and just keep moving. Because I think we have, the one thing I've learned from reading through a lot of the material that Sam gave me to read through and think about was to realize just how big the issues are that we are trying to tackle, and that they're not going to be tackled easily. It is going to take a lot of hard work, and having worked in government for my entire career, I know how slowly it can work, but I also know that it can be successful. And so I want you to know that I am here to tell you that you can have success. I have worked some things that I think people thought would never have happened, but they do, and they did. And I want you to know how important the work you do is so that you'll have the patience to get it done. And so I just am incredibly impressed. I just came back to Harvard because I got fired by the current administration. No, I retired. I retired. But it is wonderful to come to Harvard because, you know, honestly, Sam asked me to come here and I had to do research for the first time. I had no peeps to do research for me. Where were my people? But it was a good thing I was out of a job, so I had nothing else to do, so I did that. But it's wonderful to be reading about it because the multidisciplinary approach that planetary health really takes is really quite amazing. And it looks a lot like how people look and how people think, which is why it actually has an opportunity to succeed. You know, you don't get to look at one thing and focus it on life and then have that be the most important thing ever, and then try to get everybody to come to you. It really looks at life in a much different way. And I think, having been in the public health business for a long time, I've learned way long ago that if you approach people with just a singular point of view, which is yours, you'll be shown the door as quickly as you can possibly imagine. Because the door you need to walk through is their door, not yours. Their life is what you're trying to get them to reconsider and think about and move forward. And so it's been amazing to me to come to Harvard. And I know that I spent a little bit of time earlier. What is it? Is it Sunday? Sorry, I'm losing sleep here. Last week, I was at the Harvard Global Health Initiative conference, and I gave a keynote there. And it was really fun to do that, because as I started reading this planetary health stuff, all I kept thinking about was my undergraduate degree is in social anthropology. I really wanted to be a social anthropologist. I actually think I am, although I haven't read anything having to do with social anthropology in about 30 years. But I'm pretty good at it. And so all I kept thinking about was an old book, a book that I read from Jared Diamond. Did anybody remember Jared Diamond? Come on, seriously. He was great. But it was a book he wrote, and I went and I looked at it. It's called Collapse, you know, that guns, germs, and steel. And in this, I love these quotes, because all I kept thinking about was going back and looking at this. And it basically, Diamond was talking about the Mayan leaders, because I was fascinated by how the Mayan civilization actually collapsed, why it did. And he basically is pointing out the fact that they basically outstripped their resources. That's what they did. They forgot they lived in a limited world, which I think many of us might forget as well. But here's his quote. He said, "Their attention was evidently focused on their short-term concerns of enriching themselves, waging wars, erecting monuments, competing with each other, and extracting enough food from the peasants to support all of those activities." Does any of this sound familiar to you? And then it says, the only question is whether they will become resolved in pleasant ways, whether these issues will be resolved in pleasant ways of our own choice or in unpleasant ways not of our choice, such as warfare, genocide, starvation, disease, epidemics, and collapse of all societies. He's a friendly guy, Jared Diamond. And then it says to succeed. He says we need to have the courage to practice long-term and bold, courageous thinking versus narrow-minded, short-term thinking. You know, if I had anything to say about how I would sum up life that we need to really think about in movement, it would be just that last sentence. Let's just stop thinking about today and let's start thinking about tomorrow. Isn't that what we all care about? Isn't it our future? Isn't it our children's future that we're all working towards? So I know I'm not a social anthropologist, but I call on those skills every time I walk the halls of Congress and think about primitive societies. I am actually a public health person who has spent decades working in environmental agencies, believing them to be lousily called. You know, they are not environmental agencies. They are actually public health agencies. If you've worked at EPA, you know that we are a science agency. We are a public health agency. So when you look at planetary health, you really have to think about whether there are lessons that we have learned, or I have learned, is what I try to think about the ebbs and flows of success and failure, and when have we done well, and when have we not. And I really want to share some of those lessons with you this morning, because I want you to understand that I fully recognize that planetary health is actually well beyond the framework of climate change. I think it would be a serious error in judgment to pull it back within the limitations of climate. I don't think that's what it's all about. I think it's much beyond that. It looks way beyond the impacts of carbon pollution on our society. And I don't want it pulled into that framing because I don't think it would be as productive. We are having enough trouble talking about climate change effectively. Let's think about this in a much broader and more impactful way. And so I want to talk a little bit about the ebbs and flows of what we have learned in looking at climate, even though we are not simply limiting ourselves to climate as part of the problem. And I'll tell you, I have a little bit of challenge doing this because I'm a very hopeful person normally, but I've had a bad couple of days. Friday was not a good day for me. It's never a good day when you have a science agency and they have to take climate change off of its webpage. That's never a good day, and that's what happened to EPA, coincidentally the day before we were going to have climate marches. But having said that, I was at the climate march yesterday in Miami. That's one of the reasons why I can't hear anything and why my bronchitis is so bad. Do not fly in a plane when you have asthmatic bronchitis. Doesn't work well. So I got to Miami, and it was an amazing thing. People just started to come and started to come and started to come. And the lesson that I learned there was that climate change in Miami is not a partisan issue. It's simply a fact of life. Now, there are partisan folks trying to stop climate actions from happening. But the amazing thing was that you had people from all walks of life getting together, talking about climate change, looking at the damage that is happening, and looking at the opportunities for success. So I have to take heart in that, even though it was a pretty bad day. But I also have to remember that there's a lot more going on in the lives of those people than what we talked about, because I was in Little Havana. So they were just as worried about the immigration challenges as they were about climate change, which is the point I'm trying to make here, I think, is that people are multidimensional. You can't ask them to focus on one thing without giving them latitude to focus on the more immediate thing that's sitting in front of them. If you don't allow them to create their own priorities, you're making a mistake. Because they have to. They have to learn to live. They have to learn to survive. And so one of the interesting conversations that I had the other day was with a student at Harvard. And she came up to me and she was extremely worried because I'm trying to stay very hopeful about climate change, because I mentioned that there are ebbs and flows in the work that have been happening. I haven't seen the biggest ebb like this in a very long time. But I've been trying to tell people not to be quite so worried about climate, because you can't trump rules with executive orders. We have a lot going on for us. We have crossed a considerable hiatus over the past 20 years in getting people to understand it, wanting to take action, getting solutions on the table. I mean, all of that is true, but what she said to me was, are we too late in acting on climate? Is it already past the tipping point? I'm really, really worried about it. And my only answer to her that I could give to her was that, you know, it's taken a long time to get here. We now, I think, have a momentum that no single administration or individual is going to change. I said, but also, in my life, I have seen so much destruction of the natural resources, so much. And the natural resources always seem to come back. They always seem to survive. No matter what, life seems to pop back. And her quick answer to me in no uncertain terms was, I'm not worried about whether nature will come back. I'm worried about whether human beings will be in it. That was a really good point. And that's when I started understanding planetary health. And realize, you know, and then I quickly shifted to the ozone layer, which was my favorite second story, about how we saw the ozone layer we discovered, and we got together actually as a world without knowing what the solution was, realizing we had a problem, and we actually have gone almost so far as to close it already, and we will get there. So there are things we can do, but I think we both left that discussion pretty unsatisfied that we had real answers to these questions. But understanding that the questions and the problems that we had are layers of science complexity that we need now to communicate effectively. So if you think climate science is difficult to communicate, try planetary health. Seriously. It's amazing. How do we explain to people that the work we have to do is really about understanding the ecosystems that underpin us and sustain us as humans? And how do we deal with the gaps when we realize that those ecosystems have lost their value or their services? Things have changed, whether we did it or nature itself did it. And how do we fill in those gaps? So while the work is fascinating and it has to happen, the thing that I want to tell you is that you've got some challenges ahead, some real challenges in figuring out how to communicate this. You have real challenges in figuring out how to get people to digest the message you're trying to give them and to figure out how to act decisively. Now, I know that Senator Wirth and his panel have talked about some of these challenges and the fact that you can make progress on it. But let me give you a couple of the lessons in the words that I would give you in terms of lessons learned of what we did well and what we didn't with climate, and what actually, I think, needs to happen in order to communicate these things effectively. Now, first of all, climate science, I realize, is a difficult concept that goes way beyond looking at immediate things or things within a political term of office that make it extraordinarily difficult. But so does what you're looking at. So does planetary health. And so you need to make your stories, and Marshall is the best one to explain this. Every time you talk, it needs to be a personal issue. You need to make a personal connection. I don't care why anyone cares about the thing you want them to care about, but if they do, latch onto that and run with it. If you think it's a terrific public health problem and they think it's the worst economic devastation problem in the world, agree. Run with it, go with it, hang out with that person. And it has to be compelling. But one of the most difficult things you're going to face in planetary health, the health issues, is if you make it so compelling that people don't think they can fix it, they will deny it till the end of the earth. So you need to grab people and engage them. If you make them afraid, you've lost them in a moment. And we learned that, at least we should have learned that in climate. We did that for the first 20 years of climate. The world is changing. If you don't act tomorrow, you've missed the boat. Nobody acts tomorrow. I don't buy cough drops until a day and a half after I need them. So you have to stop it. So you have to not just be personal and compelling and make that connection, but you have to be hopeful. And for God's sakes, you have to be engaging. If you go to them with both a problem and the solution, they'll reject it immediately. They want to be part of determining the solution, especially if you're going to people in their own community to talk about their problems. If you go in with the solution, you will find a door quicker than any rabbit hole you have ever fallen in. And guess what? You should. It's not your business to tell them the solution. It's your business to give them the information. Let them engage. Let them decide about their own future. They just need information. That's what science is about. So you have to translate it clearly. And I'm going to give you two other little helpful hints. One is that almost anything good happens locally. I really hate to tell you that when past 8 years I've worked at the federal level and I think I've done good. Everything starts locally and works itself up. Anything good. I've been in the federal government for 8 years. Nobody ever thought of an idea that we didn't think about, probably when I worked in the town of Canton. You know what I mean? It works up from the bottom up, so it takes time. And you need to nurture that and let it take its time, even if you feel like you don't have any time to spare. It's the only way that it works. And health matters a lot. Now, we will hear from this administration, as we heard from many others, that people only care about the jobs and the economy, as if jobs and the economy have nothing to do with health, or health has nothing to do with jobs and the economy. It's the most frustrating sentence in the world to say that we have to stop protecting the environment and people's health so that you can have a job. Dead people don't work well. I'm done. They usually bang in sick or late or whatever. It's ridiculous. So we have to focus on public health. It happens to be the rallying cry that most people rely on. It happens to be. So planetary health is a good term, at least the second one. Not sure about the first. because information is power and local is where things happen. My last ditty is that in the world, my world, I have spent a lot of time doing environmental stuff. And to me, in the environmental arena, the most personal resource that people relate to is water. I cannot tell you why, but it is a religious symbol in almost every religion that we have. Water is what people take most personally. They see it, they feel it, they taste it. We have spent too much time, God forgive me, in talking about air pollution. We have to talk about water, because I honestly believe that that is the biggest threat that we face both in the United States and internationally, is the threat to water. And if we can connect people to water, they will take action. They will do what they have to do. This morning I read the Globe. Big fishery story. Did you see it? How do people get their arms around that? How do they think about it? So as we look at solutions and as we tee them up, as we engage them, the most important thing you need to remember is that you really do have to not just make it personal, but have them think about the solutions. I can remember the big fisheries issues in the Boston Harbor, out in Steelwagon Bay, all the fisheries losses. We didn't fix that. We didn't even come close to fixing it, because immediately we had no solutions to that problem, immediately. And that was a significant challenge. And so we have to think differently about how we approach these issues. And I'm going to give you just a couple of examples, because the last issue is, I think, the most important, and that is that information is power. Transparent information changes everything. I'm going to give you one little ditty. Beijing, China. Put an ear monitor on top of the embassy in China. People in the embassy started tweeting about the results. People outside find out everything happened. Everything changed. The people in Beijing all of a sudden knew they were not breathing clean air. They knew that they were not being told the proper results. China all of a sudden had a social challenge on their hands. They had to fix it. Instead of simply looking at it as an air pollution problem, they understood it to be an economic development problem. And they were not going to slow down their efforts to move people out of poverty and into the environment, because here's your last lesson, out of poverty and into jobs. The last lesson is that poverty messes everything up. Poverty is the challenge that we're all facing. Don't ever make any mistake about it. At the root of all the challenges environmentally and from our health is the challenge of poverty. People will not give up and talk to you about a long-range solution to fisheries if they can't put food on their table, period. So what happened in China was, instead of making those choices, they actually thought about how they could grow sustainably. They have actually embraced the challenge of climate change. Instead of just picking up their industries and moving them out of Beijing so that the air was contaminated where people weren't. That was the cough talking. They thought about it differently. And it all started with one ear monitor. And if you think it's too simple a story, I don't agree with you. I have been there, I have seen it. And the second thing I want to say is that if you think about these lessons, if you think about what you're doing, you'll have to realize that you're challenging people in a fundamental way to think differently about their world. A way that's very different than how they are taught, mostly in school and in their religion. We are taught that we are the center of the universe, human beings, and the world is here to serve us. That's what we're taught. You are asking people to embrace something different. You're asking them to embrace the fact that our ecosystems can control our destiny, and that we are the ones that must adjust, not the natural world. It is going to be a very difficult challenge for you to make that case, but it is a case you must make, because it's a case that science tells us is fact. And it's about time in this country and everywhere else that we stepped up and realized that science must drive decisions, but human beings can still be elegant, rich, wonderful communities. We can live within the footprint of our natural resources. But we cannot do it if we deny. And we cannot do it if we fail to listen to that every individual and what they think and what matters to them. Because the community is where you want to have your conversation. Not the international community, one community at a time. Give them information, respect them, tell them what the science says, and we will make progress. That's how we have done it in the United States, and guess what? We'll do it again once this administration decides it ain't working the way that it's working. Okay? And we'll get there. We'll get there together. So thank you for the community level work you're doing. Thank you for bringing the big science to the table, because I think they can marry just fine, and we will make progress, but it will be difficult. And I want you to know that, as my mother always said, nothing good ever comes easy. Pull up your big boy pants. Thanks, everybody.